For my safety, I don't want to reveal which park system I work for, but it is important to the story that I, female 19, work a position at a Michigan nature park, not entirely dissimilar to that of a park ranger. My job duties usually include manning the entry booth and locking up the buildings at night. And, although not a usual duty, sometimes they ask me to walk or take a park vehicle through some of the trails, as I am on the younger side but still have several years of experience at the park. I'm a relatively experienced outdoorsman. I've had some odd things happen to me while on the job that I can't quite explain. I'm decently well versed in some areas of the paranormal, and although not entirely relevant, it's of note that I am also a Norse pagan, as part of a family belief, and often wear protective symbols as well. To be honest, I've started wearing them more since these odd things have been happening. I've tried looking into it myself, but overall, I'm overwhelmed and not sure where to look, so a friend suggested I ask a forum like this about my experiences. There are two things in particular I want to ask about. Thing 1. I usually work the night shift, and this night in particular, it was raining a lot, and the conditions were getting unsafe. I was posted out in the booth, which has multiple miles from the office, so when things took a turn for the worse, my boss radioed me back. Some people who don't spend a lot of time in the woods don't realize how dark deep woods are, much less how dark things can get at night. But I had both a flashlight and the light from the booth, which gave me probably 30 feet of visibility. When I went to grab my stuff so I could lock up the booth and get to my car, I swore I saw something that moved very human-like, but moved oddly. The only way I can describe it is if a horse-deer hybrid tried to run like a person, but there were no people out there, and it was most definitely not a deer. I'm probably not describing in the best way, but it was very off. So I got to my car ASAP, and it didn't start right away. A bit odd, but not entirely out of character for my car. But when I turned the key a second time, right as the car started, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and it looked like whatever it was had gotten closer. The drive goes without incident, but I'm still off about what I saw, and when I get closer to the office, I radio in to see if they needed me to pick up anyone, and the radio didn't work right, which was very out of character. These radios are designed to work in awful conditions, and I was the closest I'd been to any sort of signal in a while. I chalked it up to the weather and pulled into the office, but as soon as I do, something runs past me. I didn't get a good look at what it was, but it was not a person, and I'm telling you, there's not an animal in that woods that I know of that looks like either of the things that I saw, and I just can't seem to shake it. Thing 2. This happened more recently, and is what prompted me to finally reach out to a forum of some kind. I was walking the trails for security purposes, close to closing. We close around 11 p.m. and start a final walkthrough around 9 p.m. We do this to make sure no one's stuck on the trail or hurt, so they aren't stuck overnight, when there are fewer staff around and none that patrol those trails. So I was walking one of our trails, and I was pretty deep in the woods, about 2 miles in, when things started to get weird. I hear a noise off in the distance, and at first, I thought it could be a coyote or an owl, so I pressed on. Coyotes stay off the trails and won't go after people unless they have dogs, and they know when and where we do out sweeps, so they stay a good distance away. But then the noises got weirder. I don't know. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, and I know the area and the wildlife very well, and I have never once in my life heard that sound before. It didn't come from any animal I recognize, and it most definitely was not human. I've never aborted a sweep before, even when I've had coyotes nearby, but it did not feel right, and I got out of there. We are allowed to use our judgment in these cases. If anyone has any idea what either of these things could be, please let me know. I would really appreciate it. This is a story from when I was on a road trip. I decided one night, after some heavy drinking, to gather a few friends and go on a road trip to Sydney, Adelaide for a long weekend. We packed the van, figured it would be a few days' trip, so we would have to camp out for a night, unless they just wanted to keep driving through. We finally left fairly late in the day because we underestimated how lazy and hungover we all were. We eventually get on the road around lunchtime, making decent progress, just flooring it down the highway. It starts to get quite late in the evening, and we've all had a turn driving. Some of us are beginning to feel uneasy and carsick from being locked in all day, so we say fuck it and pull over, and we make camp for the night. My friend gets increasingly sick as the night goes on, and starts throwing up constantly into plastic bags that we had in the van. There's no way in hell I'm sleeping in the van with those bags, so me and another mate set up our swags, kinda like mini tents or sleeping bags for one person, and we go out in a rest and revive station set up along the highway. But we are within earshot of the van. It's a beautiful night, full moon and stars that are bright as shit. My swag has a flap that you can open to see out of the sky, but with a mesh for protection from bugs and other stuff that might get in. I decide to leave mine open so I can talk to my mate and watch the stars. I eventually fall asleep with the flap open, and I wake up in the middle of the night due to something draping over onto or hitting my face, and whatever it is, it feels warm, and it smells horrible. I start to freak the fuck out, but I'm frozen in fear. My eyes slowly adjust, and I can see a silhouette of something peering into my swag. I violently close my eyes and pray to God that whatever it is doesn't kill me. The swag shudders suddenly, as if something climbed on top of it, but then the silhouette disappears. I hear the car door open and the sound of running. My sick friend rushes over to my swag and unzips it in hysterics. "Are you okay? Oh my God, I watched it the whole time. Where the fuck is Aaron?" We both turn on our phone torches and leg it over to his swag. It looked like he had been dragged a few meters, and the pegs were out of the ground. He's literally frozen and wide-eyed, and he starts whimpering and crying when we get close. We grab him and bolt for the van and lock the doors, huddling on the floor. We just lay under a blanket for the next few hours until the sun comes up. The next morning we start the van and we just drive, leaving all of our shit behind. We went to the nearest police station and tell the cops our story, and they follow us back to where we were set up for the night. And sure enough, both of our swags are spattered in something. It looked like spots of dried saliva on the mesh, and it smelled awful. It kind of reminded me of decayed meat. We pack up all of our stuff and head back toward Adelaide. We still have no idea what the fuck happened that night. The cops think it might have been some animal, but Mark is adamant that whatever he saw outside the van was stooped over and moved, quote-unquote, erratically. I am never camping out during the night again. Fuck my country so hard. Fair warning, this is a slow burn, but 5 years later, I still get creeped out thinking about this encounter and whether it could have ended very differently. This occurred a few years ago in 2019, while my partner and I were taking a road trip across Canada. We'd rented a car from Vancouver and were just making our way towards Banff, up to Jasper, then back towards Vancouver via Whistler, a little anti-clockwise loop. All in all, we'd traveled for around 5 weeks, sleeping in national park campsites or rest stops along the way. One evening, somewhere along the Crow's Nest Highway between Paulson and Castlegar, we arrived at a provincial park campground, where we intended to stay the night. It's a nice easy spot next to a lake with a large parking area, many benches, a wooden shelter, but also far away from any civilization. There were already a few other people there with motorhomes and caravans. We were the only ones with a tent. We arrived before dark, shared some polite greetings with other campers, and we set up the tents. There was one guy in particular, an old chap I would guess to have been in his late 60s, with a motorhome, who was very friendly and chatty, but, well, a little too chatty. He noticed we had a coffee pot with us and mentioned that he had a 5-kilogram bag of coffee beans in his motorhome, if we wanted some. He followed up by saying he didn't even drink coffee because he didn't like the taste. He kept offering for us to come to his motorhome to get some beans, which sounded a little odd, so we politely declined. He eventually left, so we finished getting the tent pitched and went to prepare dinner in the on-site shelter. On the way there, my partner and I shared a few glances, just to say that we both thought he was a little creepy. We kept our eyes open while we were cooking, and noticed he wandered off towards the lake, presumably for a walk. While we were eating, we spotted him returning. Trying to avoid him, we just avoided eye contact and stuck to eating our dinner. Unfortunately, he spotted us and wandered over. Despite us being partway through eating, he began chatting with us. Being the type of people who never wanted to be rude or offend, we politely returned conversation, and we nodded, and we ate. I don't remember the whole conversation, but a couple of things stood out to us. He asked us questions about our relationship. If we were married, did we live together, did we have children, and did we want to have children? Some questions bordering on being a little too personal. It could have been considered innocent coming from a relative or a friend, but coming from this stranger, we just felt some uncomfortable undertones to his questioning. He noticed we were drinking water with our meal and asked if we drank Coca-Cola. He mentioned that he had a multi-pack of Coca-Cola bottles in his motorhome, if we wanted some. Though, said he didn't drink the stuff himself. He again persisted in inviting us to his motorhome to take a couple of bottles each. We, again, politely declined. At this point, my partner and I were sharing glances, and we noticed that we were both feeling uneasy around this guy. So we quickly finished up dinner, making an excuse to get up and leave, realizing he wasn't going to leave us alone, so it would just be easier for us to leave him there in the shelter. We cleaned up our cooking stuff, packed everything into our car, and prepared the tent for the night. Whilst doing so, he approached us again on his way back to his motorhome, again inviting us to come and get some Coca-Cola, or join him watching TV if we wished, and again we politely declined. At this point, the light was fading, so we took ourselves down to the lake for a quick walk, brushing our teeth as we walked, rubbish bag in hand to dispose of the bins at the bottom of the car park. As we approached the bins, we noticed a large shadowy figure leaning into one of the bins. Startled by our presence, it jumped down from the bin onto all fours and ran for the tree line. Both my partner and I froze. There was no mistaking it. It was like a large cat-like silhouette with a long, slender tail. We had just interrupted a mountain lion foraging through the bins. Thankfully, it was more afraid of us and made a run for the trees before we had even realized what we had seen. Startled, we both turned back and fast-walked back up the hill, agreeing that we would instead sleep in the car that evening, not knowing whether that mountain lion would have been lurking nearby just beyond the tree line or not, but we decided not to chance it. We reclined the seats, locked the doors, and slept until morning, thinking of the close encounter with the mountain lion, and having put the creepy old camper to the back of our minds. In the morning, we woke early before anyone else, and packed our tent, and got the hell out of there, heading for whatever town was next on the map. Relieved to have left that entire scenario behind. We didn't bump into either the creepy old guy, or the mountain lion again. Continuing on our journey, we wondered if perhaps we had misread the whole situation with the creepy old guy, but I like to think that our intuition is pretty good, and both of us sensed that there was something off. Later that day, I received a call from my brother back home, checking up on us, making sure that we were okay. He'd seen on the news that there was a manhunt underway after a spate of killings that week, and naturally he was concerned for us. Turns out, there were 2 guys on the run after murdering 3 people further north toward Alaska. The suspects didn't resemble the old guy we met in any way, but it did make us wonder what his intentions were. Thinking back to that experience, we wonder if we did overreact. Whether this creepy camper was just some harmless grandpa looking for company and conversation, or perhaps we were fortunate and avoided a much different fate. Trust your gut if something doesn't feel right. I'm curious to hear anyone's thoughts on this situation, and whether we should have handled it differently. I'm not one to post these kinds of things. I mostly just have Reddit to look at bugs and read about roommate drama. But I had an experience in the woods one night, almost 10 years ago, that got brought up recently and, well, I thought I would share it here. I, female 16 at the time, snuck out of the house to go smoke weed in the woods at about 3 a.m. I go into the Lynn, Massachusetts woods. It's not a huge sector of woods, just a wee reservation smack dab in the middle of the Boston suburbs, surrounding the local reservoir. I got to the entrance of the trail, parked my car, and made my way to the campsites. It's about a 5-minute walk, where there's usually fire pits available. It's a popular smoking area for teenagers, and I was one of them. I set up the draw by the fire that I had made, and began to roll a joint. As I was rolling, I heard something on 4 legs come up from behind me. I didn't sweat it that much, because where I'm from, the worst it could probably be is a coyote. But then I heard it transition into 2 legs, and walk with a bipedal gait. That confused me. And then everything went silent. No crickets, no birds, no sounds from the forest, nothing. The only thing I could hear at that point was the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. I became concerned that someone, or something, was behind me. I call out thinking maybe it was just a homeless dude working up the courage to ask me for some food or some money, since it was the city after all. I say hello and ask if anyone's there, and there's silence for about a minute. Every fiber of my being is telling me to run, but I stayed, because I thought if it was an animal trying to hunt me, I should stand my ground and make myself appear like I'm not worth the risk. And then, whatever it was, it talked. It sounded almost like a parrot mimicking its owner's voice, and I swear to God, it asked to bum a light. At first, I'm relieved because at least I knew it's not an animal, but the way it spoke was just unsettling. I said, "Sure, but you have to come out here where I can see you. You're giving me the creeps, dude." And then it asked again, and again, 3 times. I was freaked out now, and I knew something was off. I told it to fuck off and find someone else to ask if he was going to be creepy about it, trying to sound as tough as possible, and then it ran off. I could hear all 4 feet hitting the ground as it ran away. It was such an odd sound. The crickets came back, the night birds started to chirp again, and the air even felt warmer, lighter. That feeling of dread washed over me, and I knew I had to just book it out of there. I calmly packed all my stuff back up, put out the fire, and made my way back down the trail to my car. I wanted to run, but part of me still believed it was just some dude trying to get creepy with a 16-year-old girl in the woods by herself. And if I played it cool and acted like I wasn't scared, maybe he would back off. My mother always taught me to make a scene in that scenario, and I was prepared to knife whatever came at me. I also thought maybe if it was an animal, I wouldn't trigger its hunting instincts if I just walked instead of ran. But man, every hair on the back of my neck was standing up. That feeling of being watched is real. I finally see my car about 200 feet ahead of me. I feel safe again, but I'm still on alert. And I feel secure enough to look behind me, and sure enough, maybe 40 feet behind me, is a male deer on its hind legs in the middle of the trail. I fucking freak. I've never heard of a skinwalker, and I never believed in anything like that at the time, but I knew something about that image was seriously wrong. I lost my composure and I booked it to my car. I made it back with no problem and drove off before I could even turn my headlights on. To this day, I've never been back to those woods. I'm deathly afraid of nature now, which sucks, but the very idea of spending a night in the woods makes me so anxious that I get nauseous. It wasn't until years later when I fell into a YouTube rabbit hole in college, when you just pick one video suggested on your recommended page and let autoplay take you wherever. Only then I stumbled on a video that described skinwalkers and alleged experiences people have had with them in the woods, that I truly began to understand what I may have encountered that night. This shit is real. I don't know if they're as aggressive or dangerous as people make them out to be in the stories I've seen online because, well, in my experience, it seemed pretty curious and backed off when I confronted it. But even now, just thinking about it, I get this pit in my stomach. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on this. Hell, I would love if you could even debunk it. I love those woods and sort of wanted it to just have been a weird homeless dude. But I've heard some weird, very similar stories from the locals about those woods. And now I don't know what to think. I said I would love it if you could even debunk it, as if like a skinwalker is like the most logical thing possible. It couldn't have just been some fucking tweaker. No, it was a skinwalker, guys. A skinwalker asked to bum a joint. And then I was like, hey, you're being weird. And the skinwalker, the witch, the cursed cryptid that eats people, yeah, it just fucked off. It just ran away. Because me, a 16-year-old teenage girl, told it was being weird. And I was like, you're ruining the vibes. And the skinwalker was like, oh, my bad. Shit, man, my bad. And he ran off. I wish you guys could debunk this, but it happened. I'm being so shitty. What is the scariest thing you'd ever seen in the forest? Avid hiker and nature enjoyer here. I've got a couple of stories. A recent one was on a pretty popular and well-kept trail in northern Wisconsin. I visited that trail frequently in my early 20s. It had a couple of loops, ranging from just over a mile to a couple reaching nearly 7 or 8 miles. One year, I noticed that someone, or some group, began to place animal bone effigies along various trails. These bones were cleaned and bleached like a stark white without any staining. It started with just little bones inserted into rotting trees and stumps. Then, I started finding bones tied together with twine, made into weird symbols, hanging off from trees just off the trail, usually significantly above eye level. Then I started to find entire deer limbs, shoved into hollows of trees or between boulders, still bloody and raw, but strangely avoided by insects. Eventually, I started finding heaps of, presumably, deer meat just lying on a boulder off trail, strangely uneaten by animals or bugs. I'm sure it was just someone pulling pranks, or some wannabe witchcraft stuff. It was just odd because I walk that trail several times a week, during all hours of the day, from nighttime to morning or noon, rain or shine or snow, and I never saw anyone hanging or arranging things like that. Another time, when I was 17 or so, I was backcountry backpacking in northern Minnesota, along with 2 friends for a week-long trip. On the second day of our journey, shortly after we began the hike for the day, we passed a guy with a huge black wolf dog. He stops and chats with us briefly. He gave me ex-Marine or law enforcement vibes, but something about him and his dog made me feel uneasy. The dog kept whining and looking down the trail behind them, and the guy just seemed shifty, like eager to get out of there. I noticed he had a pistol holstered at his hip, which didn't bother me at all, but what bothered me is that he seemed so on edge, despite the security of a firearm. He told us he noticed a single middle-aged male walking off trail that morning, wearing a dark green raincoat, and that he just got bad vibes from the guy. Sure enough, later that day, the 3 of us noticed a figure in a dark green raincoat quickly step off the trail while we were walking on a long straight stretch. For the next 2 days, we thought we kept seeing him, only behind us, only happening when we would glance behind us. And we thought we kept hearing footsteps around our campground at night. We took bathroom breaks together and never went anywhere alone, and it honestly really ruined the vibes of an already rainy and muddy hike. Every night we fell asleep damp and clutching knives, bear spray, and poop shovels, like we were about to go out fighting. On the 3rd day of paranoia, we got to a campground filled with college-age girls, all being loud and overexcited and simultaneously scared of the woods. We thought sharing the camp would be good for safety, so we warned them about the guy that we had been seeing, and their demeanor changed quite suddenly. They tell us they had been hiking for a few days from the opposite direction, and that they had encountered a married couple that warned them of the same exact guy. We thought it would be safe with them, but that night, we woke up to a girl shrieking, and then chaos broke out. Something crashed away into the woods, and a few of the braver people in our camp popped out of their tents with flashlights and headlamps. It turned out someone had tried to open one of the solo tents on the edge of the camp, and the girl inside woke up to a figure crouching half in her tent. She kicked at the figure, striking it, which made it immediately run away. Some girls were starting to panic, so I decided to gather some people together to start a bonfire, which was nearly impossible given the wet wood, but luckily, I found a stand of rotten birch trees nearby and managed to harvest some bark for kindling. Then I had some people join me to keep watch until morning. We were supposed to have another 3 days on our hike, but we decided to call it quits after that. We called our ride to come pick us up from a different trailhead, and I didn't really like hiking much after that, always feeling an overbearing sense of paranoia that someone in the woods was watching me. Here's my last story for this post. I was solo hiking in Michigan when I was around 24. It was an old-growth forest, a really beautiful region. The hike was pretty, but rather mundane and uneventful. I got a handgun for self-defense after the hysteria in Minnesota. It was supposed to be just 2 nights through a 12-mile loop of rather steep and hilly terrain, and on my first night, 4 miles in, I got to my campground at the bottom of a valley. It was oddly still and quiet, with no wind, and extremely cold for the season. There was supposed to be a creek running through the valley, but it had dried up, so I didn't have enough water for a good dinner, and ended up snacking and preserving my water for the next day. I just couldn't sleep that night. It had been the first time I was solo backpacking, and I just felt vulnerable. I was maybe 20 meters off the trail, and it was so still and quiet out. I could hear random animals skittering about, and the incessant whine of insects. I was laying there for what felt like hours when suddenly I realized that the forest had gone silent. No animals, no insects. It was like the world had been muted. Look, I'm not trying to be an asshole, but I feel like every story that I've read in the last month has all said that there was no animals, no insects, no wind, no birds. It's all the forest went silent. That's when I realized the ground had started to rumble, just very gently. I perked up and it sounded like there was a large group of people marching by, the familiar drum of boots on the densely packed earth of a trail. But it was dozens upon dozens of pairs of feet. And talking. It sounded like whispering at first, but then it became a cafeteria of people talking. Distinct voices all saying and conversing, but not a word could be made out. I felt like I was going crazy, but I could even see my water bottle vibrating from the footsteps. It got closer and the voices got louder, but I couldn't make out a word. I checked my phone and it was just after 2 a.m. My heart was pounding. What could people be doing out here in the dark? Even through my rainfly, I could see the dim light of the moonlight sky through the trees, but I couldn't see any flashlights or lamps. It sounded like 100 people were passing by. I was shaking so badly and so scared when, suddenly, it stopped. My heart froze and my throat caught a lump. It felt like I was surrounded with 100 pairs of eyes, all on me. I chambered around in my pistol and I took the safety off, just laying there, not daring to move. And I waited and waited and waited. No animals, no insects, no wind. Then, something fucking explodes. It felt like my whole world erupted. A shockwave passed through my body and rocked my whole tent. I thought I had let my gun go off at first, but all 15 of the rounds were still there. My ears were ringing. It sounded like a jet had passed by with the sonic boom. There was a roaring sound that quickly traveled away too. I nearly pissed myself, and feeling a surge of adrenaline needing to pee badly, I jumped out of the tent with my 10,000 lumens, fuck you flashlight, and quickly swept the sparse woods surrounding my tent. And I quickly dropped my pants and peed right outside my tent, with a pistol in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I felt so crazy, but I finished up and leapt back into the tent. I now saw it was 4 a.m. on my phone. I cried a little, and I hid inside my sleeping bag again. I waited until morning and I finished the rest of the 8 miles on 0 sleep. I haven't gone solo backpacking since. I've written a lot about my experiences, mainly because it's all anonymous. And if people want to think I'm crazy, it won't impact my life. I've been gearing up lately to start telling some of the really stranger things that have happened to me. The things that have given me cause to be afraid. Things that I've never told anyone. So, here's the first one. Let's go back to a time when I was just leaving school, and the summers were still long and extremely enjoyable. Around the time I'm going to speak about, I had a Welsh Springer called Tara. She was an energetic and fiercely loyal dog who never left my side. My friends used to say that if they saw her, they knew just about exactly where I was, and they were rarely wrong. So during the course of the holidays and into summer, I would go for long walks with my dog out of the village that I lived in, or council estate, and I would go out into the nearby woods. It was lovely walking with her, and she would never stray too far, and it was nice for me to just walk in the quiet. This particular walk would remain with me for years to come, for some quite unpleasant reasons. We started as we usually did, walking onto a footpath that led up a hill. Tara usually ranges about 15 to 20 feet in front of me, always keeping me in her line of sight if she looked back. It was a typical summer day, around about 4 o'clock, at the back end of August, so it would have been getting dark around 8. The idea was to walk in a roundabout circuit through the fields, into the woods, come out the other side, cross a railway bridge, and back into the village on its furthest end. Then, walk back home. About 2.5 hours, maybe 3 at a push. An hour in, we started getting near the woods, and we saw a few lads I knew walking toward me, so I stopped and we spoke for a while. Didn't keep an eye on the time, as it was the holidays, and there was no real need to rush. I must have been talking for a good hour or so I called Tara back and started walking once the lads went their way back. We got into the woods and stopped about 15 minutes in to have a drink. I usually had a bottle of water with me, which I shared with Tara, as it was only fair. As we went to set off again, Tara just stopped, staring like stock still. Where we were was a natural depression in the woods, around a 30-foot radius that sloped into a larger crater-like shape. It was lined with bushes, and there was this odd Tarzan swing dangling overhead from where kids had swung over it. I knelt down next to her and I asked, "What's the matter, girl?" She was shaking, which bothered me. I looked around to see where she was looking. It was a dense-looking bush, probably 12 feet across, that ran up the side of the slope. My first thought was a badger or a fox, so I pulled her lead out and fixed it to her, and decided to skirt around the radius, putting some distance between us and whatever it was. So we started walking across the rim of the basin, keeping the bush in sight as we did. My little dog never took her eyes off of that spot. I decided to toss something into the bush to try and disturb whatever it was. I found a stick that was partially rotted, and I lobbed it into the bush. The sound that came after the stick went into the bush stopped me in my tracks. Something hissed at me, like a cat, but a lot bigger. It scared the living hell out of me right then. My first thought was it was a 20-minute walk out of there from where we were to the railway bridge. All the while the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I never took my eyes off the bush. There was nothing around me I could arm myself with, and so my only real option was to run. Carefully, I reached down and found Tara's collar, and I unfastened her lead. I got my breathing back under control. I turned, and I bolted. Tara took off with me, thankfully, and I just concentrated on getting to the railway bridge. Whatever it was must have broken cover, as I heard it. I never looked over my shoulder as running through the woods, because, well, that's a bad idea, but I knew instinctively that something was behind me. I made it to the bridge and I turned around. Again, my dog's looking at a patch of bush 20 meters to our flank, and that's when I saw the eye shine. Now, if you are of any reasonable intelligence, you can just about work out something's size from how large the eyes shine, and how far apart the eyes are. This thing was bigger than a Rottweiler, and it was lying prone on the floor. It was dusk by now, and the street lamps near the bridge were causing the eye shine. I turned and went up the steps, thinking that could not be what I thought it was. I crossed that bridge thinking I just needed to get to the other side and onto the main road. If I get onto the main road, I'll be fine. As I was crossing the bridge, I looked down onto the tracks, and I saw something streak across them from one side to the other. It was pacing me, and judging by where it was headed, it would be right in front of me when I got to the other side. I came to the end of the bridge and started down the steps. The closest place for something to hide was right at the very end of the road that gets out into the village. It was probably 7 o'clock by now, and dusk was here, and that wasn't doing me any favors. I stopped next to the streetlight and put Tara back on her lead. We walked on the opposite side of the road till we got near the start of the massive set of hedges. Tara was going insane by now, pulling and barking. I think she was trying to scare off whatever it was. But we kept on till I was on the opposite side of the road, and then she seemed to calm down, but never took her eyes off the place where I assumed it was. As we're walking toward the center of the village, I'm now starting to panic. It would be now or never if it was going to attack us, and I knew it was moving from how my dog was reacting. And just as I was thinking that we were facing imminent danger, my uncle pulls up in his car and asks if we want to lift back. I don't think I've ever been that glad to see him in my entire life. That was 30 years ago. The only reason that's popped back into my head is because recently, someone saw something very similar, and it's made the news. As I have always said in everything I write, always trust your instincts. They may as well save your life. I've never had anything supernatural happen to me before, and I don't believe in any of that. I've lived in my van for a few years, and sometimes I would feel nervous or scared that something could happen, or that maybe the people camping nearby could be bad people, but this last Saturday night, I was terrified and paralyzed with a type of fear I've never felt before. My friend and I went camping down in the Swell, or Utah. We saw no cars on our way to our camping spot, near the mouth of Black Dragon Wash Canyon. Later in the night, around 1 a.m., we'd been laughing and making jokes inside the tent, and my dog just snapped to attention and began growling. My friend and I paused and started to listen, and we began to hear movement outside the tent. It started to sound like footsteps, and then I heard the distinct sound of a zipper. It wasn't our tent, but it was something outside of it. Every part of me went still, screaming inside that something terrible was near. Everything went silent. But then we would hear it again. Slow, deliberate steps. I called my boyfriend who was still at home, and as soon as he answered, I hung up and texted him that someone was outside our tent, and that we needed help. I've been in sketchy situations where I've had to physically fend people off, so I know I have a fight response in me, but I felt so insanely weak that all I could do was tremble while my dog growled, looking in different directions. It sounded like 2 people were circling the tent. I was texting my boyfriend and 911, and they kept asking if it was animals, but I swear it wasn't. It sounded like clothes rustling and like slow footsteps, not the scurrying of raccoons or the gait of animals, and it was silent outside of those movements. Sometimes it would go quiet, but then it would start up out of nowhere. At one point it felt like several people were circling us. We had a light inside that was lit, so it felt like every move we made was being watched. We were terrified of doing anything that could be interpreted as, well, the first move, I guess. So I didn't look up, but I swear, I saw shifting silhouettes. Minutes before the sheriff arrived, I swear I saw something press against the tent from outside. Something that looked like a hand pressing against the tent and dragging itself along it. We weren't near any trees, and it was a distinct shape or shadow, not just a tarp bending in from the wind. When the sheriff arrived, he kept saying that it was probably a deer or just some other animal, but we had been so loud. What timid animal would approach? Even if it were friendly, I distinctly heard a zipper sound and saw what looked like a hand against our tent. I felt crazy and ridiculous, but every time I think back on it, I'm just thankful I was so quick to call my boyfriend and 911. I don't know what the word for what I felt is, because terrified isn't quite strong enough. I had this crushing feeling that I was going to be violently murdered. I was writing what I thought were my last words to my boyfriend, telling him he was the best thing to have ever happened to me, and to have kids no matter what and that he deserved love and happiness, because I didn't want my death getting in the way of him having the family he always dreamed of. I feel crazy, but I can't deny how my body feels, and it feels like I would have died if I had not gotten out of there. I guess I'm just posting here because I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. I'm trying to find other people in the same area as me. I live in southwest Michigan, about an hour away from Grandmere State Park. This park has had 2 semi-recent attacks only 6 months apart. One incident included a female who was knocked unconscious and woke up hours later, where she was discovered with injuries. The other incident also included a female who was attacked while walking her dog. Both women described what happened to the local police department, and the descriptions from both victims were very similar. These attacks happened in April and September of the same year, 2024. I enjoy hiking and geocaching in my free time, but with the increase of attacks in the Grandmere area, I did my best to go somewhere else. I found a neat little park with many geocaches hidden around the area, and it was far enough away from Grandmere where I felt comfortable to go off on my own. About an hour into my adventure, I found myself off the main trail. It was a very calm and quiet day. Usually you can hear other people walking around, birds, animals, and the waves from Lake Michigan. Today there was just nothing. Just an eerie silence that followed me the entire time I was there. I started to look around and my eyes locked with a man watching me from the main trail. When our eyes met, he started walking towards me. I got this overwhelming strange feeling that I needed to get out of there. Being a woman in her 20s, alone in the woods with a strange man watching me, was not ideal. I started walking back towards the main trail. My goal was to get as much distance between the two of us as I could. He blocked the path in front of me and tried to start a conversation. I tried to get around him, but he blocked the trail, making it hard to go around. The path was surrounded by prickers and mud and etc. And he just starts asking me questions like if I was searching for mushrooms or if I had lost something. I explained to him that I was geocaching, but now I needed to get back to my car. The man just gave me a creepy smile and continued to block me from walking to my car. Finally, I was able to end our strange conversation, choosing to take another path since he would not let me pass him. As I started walking away, I looked over my shoulder to see him still staring at me, just watching me walk farther away. When I finally got back to the main trail, I stopped for a moment to look around, see if I could spot the man anywhere. I didn't see him, so I continued to walk back to my car. At this point, I can see the parking lot ahead of me. I only had about a quarter mile or so to go before getting to the parking lot. And, sure enough, the man suddenly appeared from a small side trail and started walking behind me. As I walked faster, his footsteps started to pick up the pace. I looked over my shoulder again, and now he's about 200 feet away from me. I walk faster and I look over my shoulder again, only to see that he's now maybe 100 feet from me. He's doing his best to catch up with me. At that moment, my phone started ringing, and my best friend was FaceTiming me. As I answered, I held up my phone as if I was trying to show my friend the park I found. Once the man realized I was on the phone, his pace slowed. I made it back to the parking lot and I got into my car. I noticed the man was now lingering in the parking lot until I was fully in my car. He slinked away towards a different set of trails until he vanished from my sight. The man seemed to be in his late 20s, maybe 30s, average build, darker hair, green eyes. Has anyone else encountered a strange man around the area? And if you're reading this now, and you were the strange man who followed me that day, following people in the woods is a horrible hobby. Adopt a normal lifestyle, please. Update. I did inform the local police, and there was a PSA put out by the Michigan State Police a few weeks ago regarding a similar topic. I was not able to record the man, but I have taken the time to educate all of my friends who work in that area. What is the creepiest or most unexplainable thing that has happened to you while camping or hiking? I had an unexplainable incident happen to me while hunting several years back. This is certainly not your typical hunting story. I was new to the area, and I drew my first antelope tag in an area known as the Red Desert. I specifically scouted a remote location known as Bison Bassin to hunt in. This area is probably one of the most remote areas in the lower 48, and a great area for antelope hunting. But all that's out there is some oil and gas production and uranium mining ops. Long story short, I shot an antelope about 150 yards away from me, and 200 yards from my truck. I walked out to where it dropped and filled it out and attached my tag. That is when I looked up and noticed, off on the horizon, a bright light was moving quickly, but it was hard to gauge the speed because it was probably a good 10 miles off in the distance. You can see for miles in all directions out there. One thing to note is that time and distance intervals are important to this story. With antelope meat, it's important to get this animal cooled off as quickly as possible, or else the meat can taste kinda funky. So I was in a rush to get the animal field dressed and back to my truck. That way I could pack the body cavity with ice. That being said, I tagged the buck, looked up, and I saw the light on the horizon. Thinking nothing of it, I quickly went to work field dressing. In a matter of 30 to 45 seconds, I had opened up the body cavity and removed the guts. And that's when I glanced up and noticed about a mile away was the light that was headed right toward me. In about 30 to 45 seconds, that light had covered a distance of what I estimate to be 9 miles, and it was approaching me at that speed. I couldn't tell what I was looking at as the light was very bright and flying over the top of the sagebrush and making no sound. As the light got to within 200 yards of me, after observing it for a few seconds, I could make out what it was. It was a rectangular shape of polished metal, about 5 feet tall by 2 to 3 feet wide, like a dressing mirror, and it was reflecting the setting sun, which was behind me. The flying object then dropped down below the sage, and it just vanished. Again, it made no sound, but it was close enough that I should have heard an engine noise or some sound of it flying through the air, but nothing. I was spooked and shook. I wanted to get back to my truck and leave, but I had to take the animal. I bent over and hid below the sagebrush line and quickly finished field dressing. I grabbed the leg and took off running, dragging the antelope back towards my truck. This all took a matter of 1 to 1.5 minutes before I was completely gassed, so I stopped and looked back to see if the light was anywhere to be seen. I could now see the light blasting off in the opposite direction. Again, back about 8 to 9 miles going towards the horizon, moving faster than anything could travel over that terrain. It was still reflecting the setting sun back at me. It eventually disappeared over the horizon after a couple of seconds, and I finished dragging the animal to the truck and just got the fuck out of there. I don't know what I saw, but I know it was not a drone or any kind of low-flying plane. I would have heard an engine noise, or at least some kind of wind or breeze noise of it flying over the brush. Also, that terrain could not be covered at that speed by any kind of wheeled vehicle. I even went as far to ask Fish and Game, and even the uranium miners, if they ever operated any kind of drones that could perform like that. And they said no. And I know it wasn't a drone. I've never been back to that area since. The story I'm sitting down to tell is a true one experienced by a faithful friend of mine, Sam and I. I'm often reluctant to tell this story at length to most people, as the subject matter is unexplainable and rather strange. I don't want to be viewed as the superstitious nut, but having been guided all across the country and having extensive experience in many environments around the United States, I feel I have the authority to tell this story. Essentially, what I'm saying is, I've been around in the deep, dark hollows all across North America, and I never experienced something as strange as I did that night. I don't fancify my experiences in the woods, nor do I hopefully imagine there's something more to a twig breaking. As anyone who has spent a good deal of time in the woods knows, there's no reason to. Eventually, you will experience something daring or fantastic. I'm a hunter first and foremost, and to a hunter, there's always an explanation, a reason to the wilderness and her inhabitants. It's how we identify patterns and exploit an animal's rhythm to make a successful hunt. As a hunter, you're a sort of woodsman detective, placing together clues to set yourself up for success. Let's just say this tale is a cold case. Let's get into it. It was early summer and I was itching to go camping. I'd recently received a new tent and was eager to use it. I called up my good buddy Sam and we planned out our camping adventure. We considered going up into the Grayson Highlands or even south into North Carolina. After debating it, we decided it would be more fun to camp somewhere where we wouldn't run into other people. Deep in the woods, far from anyone else, where we could bushcraft, hoot and holler, and bring a gun without fear of scaring the yuppies camping next to us. While we both had lived in the woods, I had access to the most remote stretch of woods between us. So we loaded up our stuff and we began hiking, deep into the valley below my childhood home. The hike was almost completely straight down a steep hillside, deep into a hollow that held a small patch of flat land, a floodplain area, and a creek. The small creek that ran gave the area a beautiful ambience. Early signs of summer were visible all around, and the weather was great. We hiked until we felt the need to start gathering firewood before nightfall. Behind us was a steep hillside that rose into the west for miles. In front of us was the creek, and to the left the start of another ridge and a hillside that rose high into the east and north. To our right, the valley we were in continued to go down, cutting into a deep valley. And on the other side of the creek, another ridge, separated by a small stream from the ridge to the left, which rose into the west and to the south. These two ridges in front of us ran for miles, and the little valley formed by the small creek split these ridges for a long way up until it hit the springhead. This is important for later in the story. Off to the right, further down the valley, more splits in the ridges are made by little tributaries. We started building camp by clearing the brush and leaves away and constructing a small fire pit. I placed a tarp on the ground to separate my tent from the damp earth. And remember this, the tarp extended out roughly a foot on each side of my tent. Sam had a hammock that he planned to sleep in. I've only ever camped in a hammock once, and it didn't go great. But I didn't say anything to him, thinking that maybe he would enjoy it. We gathered a hefty load of firewood consisting of some reasonably dry stuff. It was shaping up to be a nice camping trip. I've spoken about the joy of being out there on this blog before, so I won't beat a dead horse, but it was nice to be away from people. Sam and I sat around the fire and shot the shit until the sun went down. Now, one of the things Sam and I have always bonded on has been Bigfoot shows. We're both skeptics, and I would say we hold a similar or the same opinion on the subject. Our interest is less about believing in Bigfoot, but rather, we just find the subject matter to be nostalgic, to be silly, a fun thing to joke about. So I brought up the idea to Sam that we were to begin hunting Bigfoot. He laughed and thought it was a great idea, so we began doing the antics they do in the Finding Bigfoot TV show. We started with the classic, tree knocks. A quote-unquote tree knock, for those unaware, is when you use a stick to beat on a tree, making a loud knocking sound that echoes through the forest. Supposedly, Sasquatch communicates this way. We didn't think anything of it at all. As I said before, we didn't believe in it. We were just joking around. So we began by knocking on the trees and then stopping and listening for a response. After a few times of doing this, we paused. And hearing nothing, I began to think of a joke to crack and something else to do. Before I could open my mouth, we heard clear as day. A tree knock, far off somewhere on the ridge to the left. I looked at Sam and said, "Dude?" Sam just looked back at me in surprise. I then did some more knocks and we listened again. Then, off in the distance, we heard more knocks in response. Then the other ridge to the right, we began hearing more knocks. Sam at this point was beginning to get freaked out a little and was perplexed as to what it could be. At the time, I, being such a hard skeptic, carried on and insisted that it was another person, or a woodpecker. But who in the world would be out there? Deeper in the woods than we are on private land? What woodpecker makes 3 loud booming knocks on the tree? That sound exactly like the knocks that we're making, Sam voiced. I ignored his arguments and held strong to the fact that there is no Bigfoot. I then insisted that we push the envelope by doing whoops and howls, just like they do on TV. Sam was not very enthused by this idea, being the humbler and smarter one of us that night, knowing that sometimes there are certain things you don't mess with. But at that time I was full of piss and vinegar, and stubborn as a mule about the fact that Bigfoot is not real. I also had brought a gun with me, and was certain I could fight off anything that we would need to fight off. So, we started howling into the woods. It was dark that night, being a new moon, and beyond the firelight you couldn't see a damn thing. We would howl, and then wait listening for a reply. After a few howls, the excitement of, "What was that?" started to fade, and my logical, rational, science-based theory of the woodpecker began to appear true. Then, out of the dark distance, came one of the strangest sounds I have ever heard. A howl. Not a canine howl, not an owl's hoot, but a fucking ape howl. Sam's eyes were as big as backhoe tires, and even I was finding it hard to reason that one. Despite this, I continued my ignorant stubbornness, and I threw out another howl. Off to the left ridge, it replied to us again. The clearest ape whoop I've ever heard, as if it were recorded by researchers in the Congo. I looked at Sam, myself feeling more curious and excited than anything else. I reiterated, "Dude." Then something truly unexplainable and spooky happened. More whoops and howls began on the ridge to the right, and further down the valley. And they weren't random. They had etiquette, as if they were chatting back and forth with each other. The one to the left would howl, the one to the right would howl and whoop, and the first would respond, and then the one way down the valley would chime in. Sam was really freaked out now and began considering if we should leave. I, being a stubborn idiot, claimed it was just owls. Owls! We were both raised in these hollers. I've heard owls. You're gonna tell me that was an owl? Have you ever in your life heard an owl that sounded like a fucking ape? Sam argued against my claim. Well, no, but there's no way Bigfoot is real. It has to be a bunch of owls speaking to each other. There's nothing else it could be. I replied, half laughing in astonishment and disbelief at what was unfolding that night. Sam and I kind of bickered for a minute over it, and then decided the wisest decision was to stop antagonizing whatever it was in the woods. Whatever was whooping and knocking. It wasn't too long after that we decided to go to bed. I crawled into my tent and Sam into his hammock, and we left the fire going, and every time the fire died down, the woods came to life. Whether it was paranoia or paranormal, something was stirring. All around camp we could hear what sounded like things being thrown, and footsteps. From time to time we would hear another knock or another howl coming from a new position. Sam would leap out of his hammock and chuck loads of wood onto the fire, making it as big as possible. We would then lay back down to sleep, and this repeated about 3 more times. Each time the fire died, things got spookier and spookier. A few times Sam would say, "Did you hear that?" And every time I would just blame it on possums nearing camp, hoping to just find food scraps. Well, about the 3rd time, Sam ran out of firewood, meaning that this time when the fire died, it died for good, leaving us to the dark void of the Appalachian holler. I vividly remember I had fallen asleep before the fire died, and after it died, there was so much stirring around camp that I began to wake up. I was slowly waking up, thinking I was having some sort of nightmare, when I finally fully sobered, and realized that my dream was pleasant. It was the reality that was full of frightening sounds, and things that go bump in the night. The woods around us had become loud with unexplainable movement, the movement of multiple large things. The whooping and knocking had stopped, which did not comfort me. with all the new sounds right outside my door. There was maybe a 30-yard perimeter around camp that the sounds did not cross. Then, suddenly, an extremely loud crash began through the twigs, leaves, and branches. It was something large, running full sprint through the woods, starting maybe 50 yards away and running straight towards our camp. It grew louder and louder until the sound of crushing leaves turned to crinkling tarp. The creature was standing on the tarp that my tent was situated on. I was frozen, like a child, frozen in fear, eyes wide open. My heart was pounding out of my chest so hard I thought it would explode. I then heard high above my tent, not near the ground, not 4 feet up, but high above my tent, the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It was the sound of a huff and blow, exactly the way you hear a gorilla do it on TV, or how the apes in Planet of the Apes do it. 3 forceful huffs and blows. Then the creature turned around and ran back the way it came, back into the darkness of the night. Sam practically leaped out of his hammock and said, "You had to have heard that." I replied, "Yeah, let's get the fuck out of here." I slid around into the chamber of my 30-30 and crawled out of the tent. We both got busy grabbing only our essentials and started out of the woods. Using shitty dim flashlights, we made our way up the hill, frantically looking behind us into the terrible night and trying to move fast without running. We hiked a long ways, and by the time we made it back to the house, it was far past midnight. We never did see what it was that charged us, and we never did hear anything else after that. But whatever it was scared us enough to make us hike out into the dead of the night and leave all of our gear there. We returned the next morning in full daylight to gather our things, and looking back, I wish we had surveyed the area for tracks or some clue as to what it was. But at the time, we didn't want to be down there for any longer than we had to. Having been some years since this happened, I would go down there in a heartbeat and not think a thing of it. When I come home, I usually feel a sense of ease in the woods. It feels like a weight is lifted off of your shoulders, knowing there are no cougars or grizzly bears to worry about. For my western outdoorsy folk familiar with cougar country, reading this and thinking, "I don't feel a weight in the woods," my reply would be the question: have you noticed you've ever been stalked before? Cougars are some of the sneakiest creatures in the animal kingdom, and just because you've never noticed it doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I have been stalked, and it's a feeling that will stick with you and put you on edge in cougar country for a long time. I have a colleague who guides western big game in New Mexico, who told me a story once that during a hunt, he had a fellow guide spotting for him, and that guide watched a cougar stalk my friend through a grove of trees before giving up. My friend never had the slightest idea he was being stalked. I believe for an avid outdoorsman in cougar country, it is inevitable. And as far as grizzly country, it's a similar feeling, but a little different. Most ill bear encounters happen because you surprise the bear in thick woods. I have many friends from my time in Alaska who would share stories of being charged by monster grizzlies from out of nowhere. They're just hiking along and then, boom, 800 pounds of death is blasting straight towards them. And the consensus is the same among them. If you spend enough time out there, it will happen eventually. I, luckily, was never charged during my time in Alaska. I avoided known bear hangouts. But the few times I spent time in bear country, I always had this jack-in-the-box anxiety, just waiting for it to happen. What is funny, though, is despite that weight being lifted initially, an old feeling always returns. I know it's not some sort of psychological thing having to do with that patch of woods specifically, because I feel it in most places in Appalachia. It's a feeling of being watched, a feeling that something is there, and a feeling of dread. And it amplifies every time you hear some strange crashing in the woods, or a sound you cannot explain. Most of the times I've experienced this, I've had a gun, and I think to myself, come on, man, you're the most badass thing out there. Yet, I can never shake that anxiety. My brother, without having ever heard this story, reluctantly asked me over the phone one day, "Don't think I'm crazy, but have you ever felt creeped out in the woods below the house? I don't know what it is, but every time I go down there, I feel like I'm being watched. I get this feeling of dread." Hearing him say that sends shivers down my back, simply because I always dismissed this feeling, and I've swept this story under the rug for years, telling myself it was just a bear or etc. To hear my brother, who's a Marine, tell me that, certified to me that I was not simply being a pussy. I have only ever felt this in two regions of the country, Appalachia and the redwood forests of Northern California. Now, some of you may be reading this thinking that I'm a nut job Bigfoot believer. I have been reluctant to share this story for that reason, but I want to end this by saying I have no idea what it was that made those calls that night. I also have no idea what it was that busted into our camp. We never did lay our eyes on anything, but I want to reiterate that this story is true, verbatim to how it happened as I can recall it, without any embellishment. I have no idea what it was, and you can make your own decision as to what you think it was. But, being an experienced woodsman, never have I ever experienced something like that since, and I have no worldly explanation for it. Those were the events that transpired that night, and I'll let you make of that what you will. In the late fall of 2010, my dad, mom, sister, uncle, and I decided to try and hike to the Goat Canyon Trestle, located deep in the desert of San Diego County, in Southern California, near the Mexico border. The trestle is basically a very tall bridge-like structure, made entirely of wooden beams and columns, that was built with the railroad in the early 1900s. The railroad is now decommissioned, and the tracks, bridges, and tunnels are all abandoned. There is a lot of good and interesting information about the trestle online, if you're interested. It is, allegedly, one of the tallest freestanding wooden structures in the world. I believe now there is a lot more information on how to hike out to the trestle online, but back in 2010, there was very limited information about it, and you really had to search deep to get information on where to start and what route to take. My uncle was super into these remote, abandoned locations at the time, and it was his hobby to research and plan out how to get to them. There was no dedicated trail at that time to the trestle. I'm not even sure if there's one today. And you had to, more or less, make your own path across the rocky desert hills. I was a sophomore in college at the time, and we all decided it would be best to do the hike over Thanksgiving weekend, when me and my sister would be in town for the holiday, and it would be cool enough temperatures to attempt. When we got to the location where we parked our car, it was pretty barren and out in the middle of nowhere with desert all around. My uncle told us we would have to hike up into the hills ahead of us, and then down the other side through a canyon that led to the trestle. It's this canyon that the trestle traverses. The hike started off without incident, but the lack of a dedicated trail soon made it difficult. The terrain was very rocky and with loose slate-like rocks that were lined with sand and made you slip and fall easily. Within the first few hours, I had fallen and scraped my knees and hands several times. It was a lot of scrambling over rock to get up into the hills, and it took us much longer and a lot more effort than we expected. We probably started the hike around 9 or 10 a.m., and by the time we reached the top of the hills, it was already mid-afternoon, and we still had to traverse down the canyon on the other side of the trestle, and then walk all the way back to the car. Recall that it was around Thanksgiving time, so the sun would set around 5 p.m. My mom and dad were naturally worried that we didn't have enough daylight to make it to the trestle and back, and thought that we should start heading back to the car, but my uncle really wanted to see at least the trestle from the top of the canyon, and said he would go on ahead alone while we went back. Being the young, invincible-minded male I was at the time, I convinced my parents to let me go with my uncle. My uncle and I were much faster hikers than my parents and sister, and we were sure we could make it to the trestle and back with enough light. We parted ways, and my uncle and I continued into the hills towards the canyon. This is where things started getting very strange. I want to take a moment to explain a little about the area for those who might not be familiar. As I said above, the trestle is located relatively close to the Mexico border, with the abandoned tracks running between Yuma, Arizona and San Diego, California, more or less paralleling the Mexican border. This area at the time was well known to be a very active route for illegal immigrants crossing into the United States from Mexico. There were stories online that my uncle found that said that people would hide in the abandoned train tunnels to escape the Border Patrol officers during the day, and would then walk the abandoned tracks at night. Border Patrol was also very active in the area at the time. It was also a hotspot for coyotes or mules. Not the animals, but individuals who would help escort immigrants into the country, and individuals who are transporting illegal drugs. Getting back to this story, my uncle and I continued through the hills in search of the canyon that led down to the trestle. After we had been walking for a while, we came across a small grove of fan palms. If you're not familiar with fan palms, they're basically a shorter and stockier version of a typical palm tree with a lot of palm fronds arranged down the trunk of the tree, such that the actual trunk can't be seen behind all the fronds. The palms in this grove were all relatively short, ranging from 8 to 10 feet tall, and the fronds dropped all the way to the base of the tree. I remembered it was a little creepy coming across a grove in the middle of the hills. It felt like something was behind the thick layer of palm fronds, watching us, and I would be lying if I wasn't a bit relieved when we continued past them. Eventually, my uncle and I found the canyon that we thought led down from the hills to the trestle. The canyon was very rugged with tons of loose rock. You can only imagine how difficult it was trying to go down it, slipping and sliding over rocks the whole way. Once we were about halfway down, the sun was starting to set, and that eerie quietness that comes with sunsets in a desert washed over the canyon. It was also starting to get cold, with the sun dipping below the hills, covering the canyon in shadows. It was around this time that both my uncle and I started seeing things. We both swear we saw my mom at the top of the canyon, looking down at us. My uncle joked with me that my mom would never let me go on alone, and so she must have followed us. We continued down the canyon some more, and when we looked back up there, no one was there. We thought maybe she had just walked behind some rocks or something, and we began calling out to her from below, but there was no response. I admit, I was a little freaked out then, and I told my uncle that we should start heading back. But my uncle wanted to keep going and insisted that we must be close. And he was right. Around the next few bends, we saw the trestle ahead of us. It was very cool to see, but we still had a good way down the canyon to get to the base of it, let alone climb to the top of it, which was our original plan. My uncle, being the crazy adventurous guy he is, insisted we keep going, but as we were heading down further, I stumbled and sprained my ankle very badly, and decided that I could not go down any further. My uncle finally agreed and said he would just go alone a little way farther to get some pictures, and then we would turn around and head back together. So there I was, sitting alone in this canyon that was getting darker and darker by the minute, trying to mend my twisted ankle, when I looked back up the canyon to see if my mom was visible again. I didn't see anything initially, but something large moved out of the corner of my eye, up the canyon, like it was darting behind a rock. This freaked me out, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me, like I was being watched from every shadow. I remember it was quiet. It all felt unnatural. A little while longer, my uncle returned, and we began to make our way back up to the canyon. It was very dark at this point, and just a glimmer of sunset was left on the horizon. I was really starting to freak out because I knew we would be walking back in pitch black. When we were almost to the top of the canyon, my uncle, who was walking ahead of me, stopped in his tracks and pointed ahead. It was my mom again, standing at the top of the canyon looking down at us. We both yelled at her, but she didn't respond, or even move. She just stared at us. We continued forward, thinking maybe she couldn't hear us, and when we came around the next bend, she was gone again. I was losing it at this point, and I'm not sure what I would have done if my uncle hadn't been there with me. We eventually made it to the top of the canyon, and it was indeed pitch black. There was no sign of my mom or anyone else. We were utterly alone in the dark desert hills. Luckily, my uncle had a small headlamp that he brought with him, and we used that to start a slow trek back through the hills to the car, and, hopefully, to my waiting family. I can't explain to you how dark it felt out there. It felt like I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The only thing keeping us on somewhat of a path was this small beam of light from my uncle's headlamp. We had no camping or emergency gear. Stupid, I know. But we were able to find the small path that we had come by on the way into the canyon, and we began following it back. After some time, we made it back to the grove of fan palms. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't terrified seeing those trees in the dark, just standing, watching over the path like ancient sentinels. I remembered how I felt the first time we encountered the palms, and how it felt like something was watching us. I hesitantly followed my uncle through the trees, and as we walked by, there was a loud rustle from one of the trees, much too loud to be just a rodent or a reptile. My uncle swung the headlamp around on the tree, but there was nothing there. A few seconds later, there was more rustling from the tree behind us. Again, my uncle shined the headlamp at the tree, but it was completely still. It was at this moment that I felt something push me hard away from the palm that I was standing in front of, and I crashed down into the dirt. I remember it felt like something had reached through the fronds and pushed me from behind, but I don't remember hearing any rustling, even though I was so close to the tree. I was utterly freaked now, and I started yelling at my uncle that something had pushed me. My uncle went up to the tree with a headlamp and peered deep inside to see if he could see anything, but there was nothing. After that, we quickly made our way out of the grove and continued through the hills back towards the car. I remember it felt like forever walking through those hills in complete darkness, and every once in a while, I would hear rustling behind or to the side of us, but there was no way to know what it was without any light. The whole way I felt like something was following us though, trailing just behind us outside the light where we couldn't see it, but could feel its presence. Finally, we made it through the hills and were about to traverse back down to the car, and in the distance, we see a faint light coming towards us. As we got closer, it was apparent that the light was coming from someone with a flashlight, and me and my uncle were nervous whether this individual was there to help or harm us. Given the position we were in, however, we decided to make our way to the light, and thankfully, it was a Border Patrol agent who was actually out looking for us. The agent had come across my family who were waiting for me and my uncle in our car, and my parents told them that we were still out there. The agent then immediately went looking for us. The agent led my uncle and I back to our car where my terrified mom rushed toward me, giving me a hug and scolding my uncle. We then told my mom that we had seen her at the top of the canyon and asked why she didn't respond to us, or wait for us to get to her. And I'll never forget that sinking feeling I felt in my stomach when my mom told us that she had never gone any further after she, my dad, and my sister turned back. She said they had been waiting in the car for hours for us to return. I don't know who or what me and my uncle saw in that canyon, or what was inside those fan palms, but I know for certain we were not alone out there that night. Maybe it was all just our minds playing tricks on us, but it's been 14 years now, and I still think about it to this day. Can anyone think of a wild animal in the United States, the Pacific Northwest specifically, that could repeatedly scream for help in a distressed, deep middle-aged man's voice? One that is, obviously, not a human. Well, anyway, backstory. I live in the Pacific Northwest, in a fairly populated but still mountainous town. I specifically live on about 425 feet of riverfront. Last night, around 9:30 p.m., Myself and my partner started hearing an initially distant, indistinguishable voice, screaming in a state of panic and distress. We live near a popular trailhead, and a few times over the years, people have somehow wandered down our road late at night, sometimes inebriated, sometimes in small groups, sometimes transient. So, when we started to hear an erratic voice, we got up, and we started initially checking the parameters of our house and the road. There was absolutely nobody out there. However, over the next couple minutes, the voice got louder and louder, and closer, and it was screaming at the top of its lungs for, quote-unquote, help. I say quote-unquote help because it was a little difficult to make out, but it did sound like a not fully enunciated help. However, whatever it was clearly in extra distress, screaming for its life, yelling, but we could only make out the hell, like help with a soft P, if that makes sense. But the word sounded the same every time. There was no variance or other sounds with it, just the word help, back to back in the most distressed voice I've ever heard. With how quickly the screams were approaching, and with a weird echo to them, we quickly realized whatever was screaming for help was actually coming from the river, actively being pulled down the river current. Our river is wide, fast-moving, and dangerous this time of year. There was no other way for a voice to be approaching so rapidly and from the location, unless they were in the river. We see and hear a lot of kayakers and know how their voices travel down there. For about 3 minutes, we heard what seemed like a distant cry for help growing louder until it sounded just like a few feet away, then slowly fading until the screaming was no longer audible. Again, this sounds like a deep middle-aged man's voice, and the screams are approximately 2 to 3 seconds apart, just back to back. At first we tried to convince ourselves that it was an animal. We do see a lot of wildlife here. Elk practically lives on our property, and we see bears and wildcats constantly. We initially thought a young elk fell into the river, but no. We Googled just about every animal distress call, every scream, fight sound, etc., and nothing even comes close to this. I've always heard that coyotes can scream like people, but not sound like an older man. I've heard bears can yell deep, however, they have no definition to their calls. And elk are way more high-pitched, and the same for all of our local wildcats. Even the birds of prey and ravens that can mimic sounds can't sound like this voice did. Initially, I called the non-emergency line because I wanted to convince myself it was an animal. However, they quickly patched me over to 911 and said I was the third call for the same thing. So apparently the voice was strange and concerning enough that even my more wilderness-raised and savvy neighbors were concerned, and the police department took it very seriously. Then, the more I thought about it, I started to think that if I were in a freezing river fighting for my life, screaming for help, I might not yell as clearly as possible due to the pure state of panic, distress, and attempt to stay afloat. The more I thought about it, the more I was sure it was a person. 911 sent out 2 police officers. They were extremely nice, and they took the call seriously, but with just 2 of them, all they had were flashlights and a chainsaw. They kinda just walked down to a few spots at the river and looked around. When our city has genuine suspicion of a person in the river or a lost hiker, they send search and rescue and a helicopter. For some reason, this time, they didn't. I told my partner I wouldn't be surprised if the next morning, when it's daylight, if someone finds a body at the river spot. But it's getting later in the morning, and I've kept my eye on the police scanner and the local social media pages, and I haven't seen anything. And now I'm back to really hoping it was a wild animal. So, tell me, does anyone know of a wild animal that could sound like that? What are the chances, if this was a human man, that he pulled himself out of somewhere down the line and got help? Or do we think it's just a matter of time until someone reports him missing, or that we find a body down the river? Update 1. Within the last 15 minutes, a helicopter has begun tracing up and down the river, and circling at an area a ways past my house. So I'm feeling a little discouraged that it likely was indeed a human. That being said, I haven't seen anything on any social media, and usually, my local police post updates about stuff like this, if it was a human, and also the locals usually buzz about things like this on social media, and I'm seeing absolutely nothing posted. So, not sure what's going on at the moment. Update 2. This update isn't super informative, but I know people were interested, so I'm back with everything I learned and processed. After thinking things over, I am absolutely 100% positive that it was a person, or, if not human, cryptid, and not some animal that fell into the river. No animal sounds I could find were deep enough, and made well-formed enough sounds constantly back to back. That all sounded like help. Even later addressed, a peacock is too abstract, a goat bleats too much and is inconsistent, and it wasn't a bird. I've worked with corvids, and we do have 2 ravens that live on our property, and this was not them. The sound was in the river, low and traveling with the current. So, not where the ravens hung out, and it wasn't their voice. I could recognize a crow and a raven voice, although, yes, they can talk and mimic quite well. This was not a corvid. This scream for help was extremely distressing, and it was consistently the same word over and over again. I'm just assuming because they were struggling, their screams were a little hard to make out the full enunciation, and I think I got stuck on not trying to overreact, so I might have tried to convince myself it was an animal, but it's very clear to me, at this point, that it was a human. I called the park rangers, and they hadn't heard anything about someone falling in, or search and rescue being utilized, so nobody looked for this person, and obviously no body was found or recovered. The river I live on is wide and wild. People die almost every year trying to swim before the current dies down in the early summer, so it's quite dangerous. That being said, right after my house, there is a bend where the river gets wider and more rocky, but it also has a very flat and fine rock bank strip on each side. So, I am hoping someone just fell in and was able to crawl out at the bank right around the corner. I talked to a couple of friends who worked in search and rescue, and they also said, unfortunately, sometimes bodies are pushed down and caught under rocks, especially in wild conditions. So, people can go literal years without being discovered. We had no power in the neighborhood. We had just had an extreme storm, and the river was at a crazy high, super dirty, and full of debris from the storm. So, obviously, it's an awful time to fall in. People were outside enjoying bonfires down by the river and drinking up the road, so maybe the theory about someone being a little drunk and falling in could be correct. I would like to think if the person didn't crawl out that there would be some sort of missing persons report at this point, but there isn't. But again, my friend who works in search and rescue reminded me that a lot of people solo hike in my area, and they can be on their own for weeks at a time, and not everyone has a family who would report them missing. She recanted finding many bodies trapped under rocks and rivers that were not reported, that had been there for a while. So, again, I don't have an answer, but my mind stopped being restless and felt positive about someone crawling out at the bank around the corner, and maybe they're just being too embarrassed to post publicly about it. I don't know. I'm going with that as it's likely what happened and that everyone is okay, but I guess I can't say for sure. I think this is all I'll ever know. Maybe no news is good news. I'm very new to Reddit, but I figured I'd give this group a shot. Earlier this year in early November, my family and I went to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The whole trip was great, and we had a wonderful time, up until the last night. We stayed in 2 cabins. The first one was in a more rural location, surrounded by other cabins. The second one was located further east in the mountains, and it seemed more like a house that was remodeled to, resemble a cabin. It had a narrow dirt road and was on a steep incline. Anyway, the night had been going great. We had dinner together, played games, and settled down for our last night together. Me and my girlfriend were sharing a room that was located on the right side of the house, closer to the woods. My brother and his girlfriend were in the room next to us, closer to the kitchen. My girlfriend and I had a little trouble sleeping at first, but we eventually passed out at around 11. And before I continue, let me explain the room's layout. The room was small. It had 2 windows, one on the back wall and one on the right side of the room. The bed was directly in the middle, with the head of the bed against the back window. My girlfriend wakes up at around 1:30 to the noise of a faint, as she described it, humming. She had woken me up shortly after it started, and that's when I started to hear it too. At first, it was barely noticeable, but as we raised our voices, the hums grew louder. They were deep, and we would hear them at about every 4 seconds. It couldn't have been a TV, as all of them had been turned off before bed, and at this point, everyone in the house was asleep. At first, we were just joking around, thinking it was an owl or some cute animal, until my girlfriend got up from the bed and turned toward the window right behind us. Before she had opened the blinds, I was hit with this sudden feeling of dread. It felt like no matter what, I could not let her look out that window. I quickly grabbed her arm and told her not to look. The hair on my arms began to rise, and for some reason, I started to tear up. This doesn't normally happen to me, and she immediately asked what was wrong, and all I could manage to get out was that something was wrong. She instantly became serious, and we both sat there, listening as the hums grew louder and closer. We both sat there quietly, just silently hoping that whatever it was would just go away, and eventually, it did. After around 15 minutes of sitting there in silence, the hums had gotten quieter and quieter until they stopped. No longer being able to sleep, we began to try looking up what it could be. We looked up all the nearby animals and the noises they make to hopefully find a match, but we were unsuccessful. At this point, it's been over an hour since we last heard it, and we began to get tired. My girlfriend turned to her side and said she was going to try to sleep, and I told her that I'll head to bed shortly. While I was tired from the long day, I couldn't help but think about what was causing that noise. So, to get my mind off of it, I watched some videos on my phone. As I turned over to lie down, my phone slipped off the bed and landed on the wood floor. Hearing it hit the floor, my chest tightened. My girlfriend, being alerted to the sound, turned over and looked at me. I didn't move a muscle. We sat in silence as we listened to that faint hum start up again. And this time we heard it get louder, like much louder. It felt like it was right outside the window. Most of the time after that was just spent in silence, as we heard the hums echo nearby. It felt like the loud noise had attracted it back to the cabin. It had moved some way off and had gotten quieter, but you could still hear that it was nearby. At this point, it's around 2:50 to maybe 3 a.m. Not knowing what to do, we just lay there and tried our best to ignore it and close our eyes. We passed out after that, not waking up again until 8 a.m. I tried to explain it to the rest of my family, and even my brother, who's normally all about this kind of thing, but everyone just blew me off, saying I was hearing things, or it was just an animal of sorts. When I tell you that I have never experienced anything like this before, I mean it. The fear that I had felt was almost unreal. And I know this whole thing feels made up, but I swear it's not. Me and my girlfriend know what we heard and what we felt. We don't even bother telling anyone about it anymore because they never believe us. They all just say the same exact thing. I just needed to get this off of my chest, and hopefully someone could help maybe explain what that sound was, or if they had experienced anything like it before. Thanks for allowing me to share my experience. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this incident, and I wanted to see if it resonates with anyone else. Me, male, 28. My wife, female, 28, and my dog recently went to Red River Gorge, a state park in southeast Kentucky. We're no strangers to camping in the park, having been there at least 20 times over the past 8 years, so we chose a spot I've been to about 2 to 3 times before. It's worth noting that this site is outside other dispersed camping areas, and is essentially the only proper spot with car parking along a 2-mile stretch. There's a dilapidated barn about a mile up from where we drove in, and a cemetery about a third of a mile in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it's a rarely traveled road, and we saw no one all day, just an occasional car, maybe one or two every hour. This spot is at the base of a 30-foot incline that a 4x4 could handle. Our SUV was parked horizontally at the top, blocking other vehicles from descending. From there, it's about 30 yards into the campground, with another slope leading to the river's edge and a swimming hole. The day itself went great. We spent time near the beach, letting our dog swim, and then did typical camping activities like hiking, foraging, chopping wood, throwing the hatchet, and, enjoying a few beers. Once sunlight began to fade around 6:30, we started a fire and began cooking dinner. As darkness fell and the last light disappeared, we heard the usual sounds. Squirrels rustling, things falling into the leaves, which spooked my wife a bit, but we didn't think much of it. Then, at about 9 p.m., sitting around the healthy fire and listening to music, we heard heavy shuffling in the leaves. Definitely something large or heavy. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the road, about halfway between us and our car. I stopped the music, and after about 10 seconds of dead silence, we heard the shuffling again. Before I could call out, we heard this strange and unnatural noise. Something like a throttling, ascending pitch, mixed with a shriek. Neither of us can verbally describe it, and I can confidently say I've never heard anything like it before. It's about 20 to 25 feet away, just outside the reach of my headlamp, and our dog went insane. Hair standing on end, barking incessantly into the darkness. He was on a long lead, or I'm sure he would have taken off after it. My wife and I were frozen. I was holding my hatchet and trying to catch any movement or sound the track. After about 2 to 3 minutes of that, with no further noises, I calmed the dog, we grabbed some essentials, and we hurried to the car. Our adrenaline was pumping as we discussed coyotes, foxes, or other animals as the possible culprits. I didn't even want to mention the possibility of people, as that would have just heightened the paranoia. We eventually passed out after about an hour, but I spent the rest of the night in and out of shallow sleep, feeling very uncomfortable both mentally and physically. I've always struggled to sleep anyway, except when I'm fully horizontal. But around 3 a.m., right next to my head, I heard a singular knock on my window, like someone tapped the glass with one knuckle. My wife didn't wake up, and I scanned the outside of the car, but I didn't see or hear anything. I struggled to doze off again, and my heartbeat was rapid. When we finally got the first light around 7 a.m., we cooked breakfast, packed up our campsite, and got the hell out of Dodge. No prints or anything out of sorts with our remaining belongings either. What's strange to me is that after hearing the noise, we heard no additional heavy shuffling from the source. With our dog barking so aggressively, we should have heard whatever it was moving away. We've looked up various animal noises native to the gorge, and nothing even remotely resembles what we heard. The knock on the window was also isolated. There were no other noises or visible happenings outside the car immediately following. Lastly, I had a thought the day after we left. I remember whistling for our dog after dark since we had some scraps to give him near the fire. Immediately I thought, shit, I shouldn't have whistled, but up until this trip I've never been a believer of those superstitions. I just like to respect the folklore I've heard. In hindsight, we're now convinced I may have invited a Wendigo or a skinwalker to our camp. I won't take those superstitions lightly again, and I'm sure this occurrence will affect at least my next few overnights within those woods. This takes place in November of 2022. At the time, I drew a special elk tag in the Beaverhead mountain range of central east Idaho. I had hunted in this area many times before over the years, and I know the area like the back of my hand. It became a place of comfort and good memories. I mean, it still is, but I haven't looked at it the same since, well, the story I'm about to tell. I planned a week-long trip for the first week of November, and I took one of my best friends with me. We spent the first 4 days hiking up and down various ridges, chasing elk and having a blast. The nights were spent storytelling and eating soup by the stove. Mind you, it was November in Idaho, so it was very cold. It was the 4th night of the trip. It had snowed during the day, and a fresh layer of snow lay on the ground. The sky had since cleared up, and a very cold, but still and quiet air had settled in. My friend and I had gone into a deep discussion about the Bible, spirits, cryptids, skinwalkers, etc. I should note that my friend had, at the time, been experiencing a decline in his mental health, and it was not uncommon for him to sometimes behave erratically. This will be relevant later in the story. During this conversation, I felt an intense fear kind of settle on me. It almost felt like the air had become tense. I had the urge to change the discussion into something else, but that's when it happened. Within 20 or 30 yards of the tent, what I thought at first was a coyote began yipping and barking very loudly. I looked at my friend, who became excited, and told me to grab my gun so we could go look for this thing. It was strange though, and something didn't feel right. The animal, whatever it was, didn't exactly sound like a coyote. It almost shrieked, as opposed to yipping the way coyotes do, and it would occasionally bark and, at times, almost scream. I'm also an experienced outdoorsman, and any other hunter knows a coyote would not approach a tent in the middle of nowhere and draw attention to itself. It would continue to vocalize for about 3 to 5 minutes at a time, circling the tent from a distance. I reluctantly grabbed my rifle and my spotlight, a very bright, intense flashlight, and started looking for this thing. As I stepped about 10 yards away from the tent, I heard it again directly in front of me, shrieking, barking, and etc. I shined my light directly at it, and I could see probably 150 to 200 yards in front of me. Yet, nothing was there. No eyes shining in the light, no outline of an animal or a person, nothing. After repeating this same scenario 3 or 4 times, we gave up and went back into the tent to warm up, but the sound wouldn't stop. At one point, when it went silent, my friend poked his head out of the tent and yelled, "Hey, shut up." Just like that. He was immediately answered with a scream from this animal. At times, it sounded like it came from above the tent in the tree we were camped under. I tried playing it off as a coyote or maybe a hunting dog that got lost, but I couldn't convince myself it was either of those, and we ignored it for the rest of the time. It slowly started going further and further away from the tent, until it finally stopped about an hour or so later. The next morning, I looked around the area for tracks, yet to my surprise, I found nothing but our own. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the trip, and a few days later we went home. Now, I don't know if it's all related, but about 3 months after this, my friend had a complete mental breakdown, and has since never been on a hunting trip. Some in his family, which is a deeply religious family, questioned whether he was the victim of some spiritual attack or something of that nature. I didn't correlate the two at the time, but in hindsight, I have so many questions about that night. Is it a coincidence that this animal thing appeared during that particular conversation? Could it have actually been a coyote or a wolf? Why couldn't I see any eyes gleaming with a flashlight? Did this incident have something to do with my friend's mental decline? My friend would sometimes tell me, and others, about strange things that he saw or heard. Was this related? Early in January of this year, I accompanied my grandfather down to eastern Tennessee to the small rural town that he grew up in. After Hurricane Helene, my grandfather wanted to see how his childhood home, about a 20-minute drive east of the town, had fared during the devastating weather. While on this trip, however, my grandfather shared with me a lot of stories about his childhood, growing up in Appalachia, and a lot of other things. I learned a lot about him that I simply had never known. One story in particular, however, was genuinely scary, and I had trouble sleeping the night after hearing it. I still occasionally have weird nightmares about it. I'll recount the story below. In February of 1954, a few weeks before my grandfather turned 12, his family's little farm had been experiencing some attacks on their animals, mainly the chickens. In the weeks before, they had lost about 7 or 8 chickens from their flock of 30 or so. They had a small property, an acre or two in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically near a place called Hall Mountain. And one night, during a fairly heavy snowstorm, my grandfather's family was awoken to the sounds of chickens screaming and flocking around in their coop some 70 or so yards away from the house. My grandfather and his dad, Paul, immediately jumped into the boots and coats and ran outside to confront what they believed would be some coyotes. As they ran outside the back door, my great-grandfather with his rifle and my grandfather with a pellet gun both stopped dead in their tracks as they saw what my grandfather described as the nastiest, most foul-looking human-type creature that you could imagine. A light on the barn illuminated the creature, and my grandfather said that it was almost completely naked, save for what looked to be a bear pelt draped around its shoulders, with a dead chicken in its mouth. Paul snapped out of his shock and fired a few rounds at the creature. He nicked it once in the upper thigh as it ran across the field, initially on 2 legs, before it then dropped down to all 4s and disappeared into the woods. My grandfather and his father stood there in shock. They made sure the rest of the chickens and the other animals were all right before my grandfather was told to go back inside. He checked on his mom and his sister, and he went back to bed, Paul staying outside for a few hours, pacing back and forth on the porch, just waiting for that creature to come back. My grandfather said he hardly slept the rest of that night, and when he got up the next morning, he saw his father in the living room on their phone. As he was eating breakfast, his father came into the dining room, whispered something to his wife, and sat at the table. When my grandfather finished eating breakfast, his mother left the room and his father cleared his throat, and he started talking. "I was, on the phone with your uncle. He'll be here this afternoon with your cousin. We're gonna follow that blood trail that was left behind by whatever that creature was we saw last night. It went down into the holler on the mountain," my grandfather said as he just shook his head quietly and didn't speak the rest of the morning. By 12:30, he, his father, his uncle Peter, and his cousin Samuel were all walking northwest into the woods, following the bloody trail left behind the previous night. My grandfather said it felt like an hour or so must have passed before anyone spoke. His uncle Peter, who was much more of a hunter than Paul, stopped everyone and pointed at something slightly up the trail. The tracks led up to a spot in the snow that was just soaked in blood. My grandfather said it looked like something had just keeled over and died. What shocked them as they approached it, however, was how it appeared like whatever had laid there had been dragged deeper into the woods. They began following the new trail that had been dragged through the snow and began noticing multiple sets of tracks which were made by bare human feet, all alongside the dragged trail. It was at this moment when my grandfather noticed his father switching the safety on his rifle to off. They trekked alongside the trail a little farther until they reached a small frozen stream. On the other side of the stream, tucked under a massive cliff overhang, was a cave entrance. My grandfather said it was about 20 feet across and maybe 6.5 feet tall at its tallest. The bloody drag marks and the multiple tracks led right across the stream and into the cave. Paul and Peter told the boys to wait behind a rock, and if they didn't shout back that they were okay in 5 minutes, to go run back home and call the police. They walked over the river and stood at the cave entrance before shining a light into it, and slowly, they walked in. My grandfather said that about 4 minutes passed before they heard his uncle's voice, but that it felt like an eternity before they saw his uncle Peter come out, and his father shortly followed. My grandfather said that they were both pale as ghosts, and that they hardly spoke on the long hike back. My grandfather and Samuel begged Paul and Peter to tell them what they saw, but the 2 men wouldn't budge, just saying they would all talk later. They returned to my grandfather's house around 3 o'clock that afternoon, and Uncle Peter and Samuel immediately got in their truck and left without saying a word. My grandfather and his father walked in through the back door into the kitchen, where his mother was waiting anxiously. Paul hugged her and whispered something to her. She nodded and went into a separate room. Paul sat down at a desk in the kitchen and motioned for my grandfather to bring a chair over and to sit down. My grandfather did so, and this is what Paul told him, apparently verbatim. Your uncle and I went into that cave and we saw people. They aren't people like you or me or anyone you know. They're very different. They live deep in the woods and they don't leave, hardly ever. They're almost like animals, I suppose. You might call them wild. It seems like they've lived deep in those woods and hollers longer than anyone has ever been here. We saw the person I shot last night, and he must have died because his people were giving him a burial, I believe. They saw us, and they acknowledged us. They didn't seem mad, but I knew we weren't welcome back there. Tommy, do not ever go across that creek. Everything over it is theirs, and we'll lead them to it. My grandfather said that was the only time his father ever spoke of what he saw in that cave. His father never went back, and neither did he. I know the whole feral people concept is up in the air, and most people don't believe it, which I completely understand. Honestly, I don't think I do either. But the way my grandfather spoke about it, the sincerity with which he spoke, and the tone of his voice during certain parts of the story, I fully believe he was being honest. He truly saw his father fatally shoot a feral human, and his father and his uncle truly saw a small feral community living in a cave deep in the Appalachian hills. I figured I'd post this here to get some outside thoughts after I've terrified my wife. I want to preface this by saying that I have hunted and hiked in the region since I was 9 years old. I'm very familiar with the wildlife and the sounds of the forest. I'm not a believer in any of this sort of thing, but I don't have an explanation for what happened tonight. I hiked about 1.5 miles through forest and swamp, hunting deer today. I got to the pocket of woods and field that I wanted to be in, and I found a tree that I could climb in and hunt out of. By all accounts, this was an uneventful afternoon and evening until sundown. For about 30 straight minutes, I listened to a rabbit being tortured and just wouldn't stop screaming. If you've heard a dog or a hawk get a rabbit or hunted rabbits, you know what I'm talking about. When they are distressed, they scream bloody murder, and this just seemed to continue on forever. Naturally, this can make you on edge, but I figured a hawk got it and just wasn't killing it. Then the sound of a twig snapping and silence. The rabbit stopped. Through the thicket, I could make out a figure, vaguely deer-shaped, moving through the woods about 35 yards away. So I grabbed my bow, but the undergrowth was far too thick for me to pick out much more than a rough outline. It walked behind a tree and disappeared. The sun is now fully set, and I'm in the last 15 minutes of post-sundown light. And I hear in a flat, emotionless child's voice coming from where that quote-unquote deer disappeared. Help, help, help. No fluctuation or distress to the voice. Not said as if it was asking for help, just a statement. Help, help, help. It said that probably 15 times, and then the woods went silent. There wasn't even a breeze to make a sound. Then, a crack of a limb of a tree snapping, and all hell broke loose in the woods. Squirrels, birds, and deer suddenly shot out of the woods like bats out of hell, sounding like an absolute stampede through the forest. And then, silence again. To make things worse for me, I lost my hat-clipped light on my walk-in, and I had to haul ass 1.5 miles through the woods, back to my truck in only darkness, my path only lit by the night's full moon. Update. I went back to the woods this morning. Last night after getting back to my truck, I called a few friends to let them know what happened, and then I had a relatively sleepless night. This morning I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided that I needed to return. I grabbed my hunting dog, called up a buddy to come with, and set out back to those woods. First I drove around the property. Nobody was parked at any trailhead, so there shouldn't be anyone around. We took a long way around, heading north to get to the woods. A few miles from the parking area, we stopped to talk, look for animal signs, and listen as we went. We approached the woods from the south, keeping on the outside of it in a tall, grassy, wet field. As we approached within 200 or so yards of where I heard that thing last night, we stopped to talk for a moment and plan how to best go about entering the woods. This isn't some manicured forest that's easy walking. The undergrowth is dense and filled with thorny shrubs and buckthorn. Whereas yesterday and in weeks past, this area was teeming with life. Deer, pheasants, hundreds of turkeys and their poults, crows, squirrels, and rabbits. And today, these woods and fields were completely silent. As we discussed this, I realized my dog was nowhere to be seen or heard. She normally wears a bell, or the metal pieces of her collar are sufficient for me to hear wherever she's at, but it's silent. She wears an e-collar that I can press a button, and it'll make a beeping noise that I can hear. I press that button, and silence. I yell for her, and silence. Then, coming from the forest ahead of me, I hear the yelping of my dog in pain. Loud and clearly my dog. I look at my friend and take off towards the woods, calling and beeping the collar, calling out and beeping the collar again, and waiting, and it just goes back to silence. I look at my buddy and he asks, "What are you doing?" As if he hadn't heard it. We stop and wait for a moment on the edge of the woods. I call one more time, and finally hear the jingle of her collar coming up to me, completely unharmed from the opposite direction of where I thought I heard her crying. Confused, we distanced ourselves from the woods again and continued north along the edge. Again, we neither heard nor saw any wildlife. We found a few spots where things were recently killed, staining the ground with rotted blood, but no signs of anything living. Eventually, we turned back, and as we crossed the same spot I thought I heard my dog, my friend stops. He looks at me in a panic and says, "Oh shit, your dog!" And he takes off running into the woods. I called after him asking what he was doing, and he just said he heard her crying in pain in the woods, and was as confused when I said I heard nothing. Just the same as when we first walked by and I was the one who heard it. I could see my dog in the opposite direction smelling around, totally unharmed. I called to my friend that the dog was fine and was over by me, and we rushed out. For those that might ask what else it may be, I have heard my dog yelping before, and that was it. It doesn't sound anything like coyotes or wolves. I won't be returning to that area again. Hi everyone. This is my first time posting in this community on Reddit, and I'm hoping to get as many ideas and theories as possible. This happened to me about 6 years ago. I'm a very stable late 40s married mom of 3. I'm an American, but I've lived in northern Germany with my family in a small, relatively rural community for 20 plus years. I know this environment very well, and I'm bilingual. As I often used to do, I would load my female Labrador Retriever into my car and drive about a mile outside of our village, into the countryside a little, so my dog could get out and run free. She was a wonderful dog, attentive and very devoted to me. She stayed in my area when we were out in the country, and we both stayed relatively close to my car. I would smoke a cigarette out there, and she would run around. We were always there in daylight, and sometimes there was a jogger or a farmer on a tractor in the distance, but we were normally alone. And again, this is a very safe area. Because I'm an American, though, I am nevertheless semi-hyper-attentive to my surroundings. And just in case, I always carry pepper spray. Plus, I have a big dog. The landscape is low and sparse, kind of brushy. A few big scattered trees, but mostly flat marshland, and you can see all around you. You can see through and between the foliage to see a rabbit run, for example, and the land is vast. So, we always drove down to the end of a dirt road, not into a clearing, just into a flat, low brush, high visibility country field landscape. Okay, anyway, so, 2 things happened in the same location, with just me and my dog present, on 2 separate occasions. They might seem like no big deal, but I don't understand. And although I was never frightened, I have always been bothered. The first thing that happened was that I, with my dog, she actively watched this event, observed a small brown leaf, just a regular dead, dry tree leaf, hanging, suspended, moving only about an inch in any direction in front of us for at least a full minute. Let me explain. There was no wind, no invisible spiderweb or filament holding it, no tree or bush suspending it. It hung, moving slightly independently in the air in front of us, directly in front of me at my eye level, and my dog looked up to it. I plucked it out of the air, and we left, driving home. I wasn't frightened, but it was memorable and odd. My dog fixated on the leaf as well. When it was in my hand, I showed it to her directly, and as I said, we packed up and left. But it was like watching magic. I just stood there and watched it for some time. Within the same period, but on another trip to the same local location, in broad daylight, I heard someone call to me. Please, and I thank you for your patience, but let me explain. I won't use my real name. Anyway, in this sparse German rural countryside, with, again, only my dog present, I heard this sentence. Julie, I can see you. I heard it from a specific direction, and it was crystal clear to me. And I would say it sounded like from a distance, quote-unquote, almost as if low shouted, but not from too far away, like 100 to 200 yards away at the most. No one was there. It was just flat fields and low brush weeds surrounding me. Nowhere to hide or stalk. No point in the brush to approach. Even worse, although I didn't recognize the voice, I would say it was male, it was absolutely in non-accented native English. So this was not a German person. And anyway, there was no person present. If there had been, I would have, of course, been terrified. But my dog and I were completely alone as far as my eyes could see. I still can't explain this. More than clearly hearing the voice, and even more than hearing my name, it was the perfect sounding neutral American English of the voice in that environment. Apparently, for me, that freaks me out. Do you guys get me? I'm in the middle of nowhere in Germany. I have a regional American accent. This was a moderate tone, like a newscaster. I know exactly what I heard. My dog did not react to this call. This voice said exactly what I wrote above. My dog didn't seem to register it at all, so we packed up and went home. I can't explain this. I'm a spiritual person, open-minded, and a religious believer. This hasn't changed me or even traumatized me, but it happened just like I've written. And while both experiences did not feel frightening or threatening, they felt strange and, I guess, otherworldly, if you will. I can't reconcile these moments. Anything involving drugs or side effects of mental health, audio disturbances, hidden stalkers, stress, and trauma can, fortunately, be excluded from theories. Believe me, I've thought about it all. I'd love to hear what anyone thinks. Here's a theory. Maybe you're lying.